In this 8th lecture, we are going to discuss two other important philosophical tools or philosophical concepts. The first is a pair, Elenchus and Aporia, they are related. And the second is Hume's fork. So let us now begin with Elenchus and Aporia. Now, if you are familiar with Plato's works, often they are in the form of dialogues. And these texts often close with Socrates enmeshing his interlocutor with the lines of argument and analysis that result in an impasse. Now let me explain what it is. Plato's dialogues often revolve around one central philosophical theme. It could be about the state, it could be about love, it could be about wisdom, it could be about any such philosophical concept. Now, but Socrates doesn't start giving lecture. Now, normally the dialogue is based on an interesting setting. Unlike us, we sit in a classroom, now online, to learn philosophy. That's not how at the time of Plato people did, though Plato founded academy and then Aristotle followed him in founding his own institution. But originally at the time of Socrates, there was no such formal structure. People are recognized as wise men, and there would be many men and very often young boys who would like to get that wisdom from that young man. So what they do, often these are young aristocratic people with a lot of wealth, so they would schedule a dinner party and they would invite people who are interested in sharing the wisdom of Socrates, and Socrates is also invited. So they would agree upon a particular theme. So then they will go around talking about that theme, and different people will give different ideas about what they think about that philosophical theme or a topic or a concept. Until a time comes when Socrates would intervene with a kind of attitude of presumed ignorance, as though he is an ignorant man, he doesn't know anything. He would like to say, well, I would like to know more about it, can you say this? Can you explain this? What could this mean then? So he asks series of questions, one after another, with the response he gets from the interlocutor, the other person who is in the conversation. Now, as Socrates keeps raising the question, as the particular person who is conversing with him, trying to respond to the questions of Socrates, the person would realize at one point, the person cannot proceed further because he can no longer hold on to the idea with which he began his argument or his assertion. Because with the series of questions Socrates asked, the person, while responding, finds that he has reached a stalemate. He cannot proceed with the line of reasoning, probably without revising the original assertion he made. That is known as the impasse. You cannot proceed further. Now, the method itself is called the dialectical method. Why? Because there is a form of dialogue that is involved here in the form of question and answer. Pretty much like what you would witness in a dissertation defense. The student affirms eloquently something, the professor keeps asking series of questions finally to make the student realize probably he or she may have to revise his or her original claim or assertion. Now, this dialectical strategy of bringing the person in conversation to an impasse. Impasse means you cannot proceed further. This is called elenchus. The strategy is called elenchus, and the philosophical impasse itself is called aporia. Aporia in simple terms would means a dilemma. You are caught up in a dilemma, whether you have to hold on to your original position, now you are not able to explain it, justify it, or whether you have to altogether give it up and adopt a new approach. So elenchus is the strategy. The strategy is of a dialectical method. Dialectical method because it is in form of a dialogue, but in question and answer form. And this is known as elenchus, and the impasse itself is called aporia, a state of dilemma. I mean, aporia is, it's a simple word. You are aware of the word porous. Porous means something through which, small tiny hole through which things can pass through. Aporia means nothing can pass through anymore. It's a negation. So you reach where you are, nothing gets through it anymore. So that is why it is aporia. Now, Socrates' elenchus shows the interlocutor's original position is self-refuting. In other words, the purpose of elenchus is to show how the other person in conversation, that is the interlocutor, his or her position is absurd, unacceptable, and self-contradictory. So this is what often you see in a debate, for example. This is the method that is used. If it is a debate which has this kind of dialogical form, then obviously if you are able to raise the right questions and then you realize that you can expose the interlocutor's position as absurd, unacceptable, and contradictory. Now let us take one example from Plato's famous book Republic. We can take many examples, but we'll stick to one example. My own advice to you, right in this beginning of your philosophy, by the end of this year, you must have read at least one of the dialogues of Plato. Otherwise, you know something about Plato from what is taught as part of History of Philosophy Part 1, I am sure. Something about the real world, ideal world, the analogy of the cave and so on, but that's bare minimum. That's what the professor is introducing to you, the ideas. But then if you really want to appreciate philosophy, then you must, all of you, that's my strong recommendation, read at least one of Plato's dialogues. I am sure that probably it would be difficult at this given stage because of the lockdown, and probably you may not have a library nearby, and of course you have no access to JDV library. But most of the Plato's dialogues you can find it online. Just type Plato's dialogues, full text online, you'll find many of them, because these things are now very often used by different people in different circles. Believe me, many of the secular students are very fond of reading Plato, not only for, they are not necessarily philosophy students, but then not only for the content of it, but the very method that is involved. That's very helpful in sharpening your mind. So pick up any of the dialogues of Plato. There are so many dialogues. Pick up any of them, whether it's Republic or Meno or Symposium. Just take any one. Today we just take the example. Now this is from the book 1, Cephalus and Polemarchus. Socrates in the Republic, in the dialogue Republic, refutes Cephalus' definition of justice. Now Cephalus defined justice. Now in this particular dialogue, the central theme they are discussing is about justice. So different people are saying different things, and Cephalus comes with his understanding of justice as giving what you owe to others. So you owe something to others, what is owed by you. Now that is how he defines. he defines it justice that way to show that it implies that, for example, if you borrow a weapon from someone, you should return it to its owner, even when the owner has become insane. And if he is insane, he is likely to do something bad with it. It doesn't matter, but you owe him what you need to give him. Now, this is how he defines justice. Of course, there are serious implications in this approach, but that is what Cephalus thinks of justice. Now, Socrates gives series of list of elenchus. Elenchus means the dialectical strategy that is involved to show that how this could be counterproductive, how this will be observed. So, the purpose that Socrates engages in this elenchus is to make the interlocutors acknowledge lack of wisdom. In other words, they really don't have answers to this. But Socrates also awakens the desire to check up philosophy in order to discover the relevant truth. So it is not merely to make someone acknowledge that they lack wisdom or they don't have answers, but it is also at the same time that you want to somehow awaken the desire. So that is part of this approach of elenchus. So in this way, the elenchus can be used both as a method to help you go into the depths of your ignorance and therefore try to get out of it. But at the same time, it is also a stimulus to make philosophy profound within you. So in other words, a stimulus to deal with your ignorance through proper philosophy. So that is what exactly Socrates does in his dialogues in Elenchus. Obviously, Socrates would raise series of questions about that particular approach. Justice is what is owed means, like I gave the example, if you are borrowed something from a person who turned mad, a gun for example from a man who turned bad, would it still be just for you to give back the weapon to him when he is in his madness? Obviously, you would kind of find yourself in a stalemate. Now, Socrates doesn't straight shoot away the question. He takes them gradually, little by little. So, it is just every question leads to the next one. Read the text for yourself. Now, the term aporia, as I explained to you, is a privative word. Privative means it's a negation. When you add a before a word, it becomes the negation of that word itself. So it simply means not porous, not having a way out or a way through it. So in other words, aporia is a condition of bafflement. It's a condition of perplexity. You don't know how to get through it now. In other words, you don't have flow of argument anymore. So this is important. This aporia is important so that you can realize how ignorant you are. Only if you begin to realize you are ignorant, then you would like to do something about it. And you will seek philosophy. And that is why Socrates uses this elenchus as a dialectical strategy, so that you can help you to reach this aporia. Now, the wisdom that comes as a result of aporia is not to be found at the end of any philosophical argument. In other words, it is not a conclusion that is true or justified. It is merely a step before you can start reasoning, you can start thinking otherwise. So, the real wisdom is to be found at the end of the argument only insofar as you accept that the philosophical argument may be brought to conclusion without determining a final true conclusion. So the modern times philosophers call this as a closure without a closure. You conclude the argument, but at the same time you realize this is not necessarily the final true conclusion. In other words, there is still more philosophical investigation possible. So in that sense, aporia has another function. The function is that it gives you an insight about the finiteness or the finitude of philosophical investigation. Now again, finite, you know what it is. It is not infinite. It is limited. Finite is something that has a limit. So your philosophical investigation does have a limit. So you need to recognize that. That is why you cannot be very sure of any conclusion that you make or any conclusion you hold so dear. Well, provisionally, yes, it is well concluded, but that is open to revision. Because after all, wisdom consists in realizing that there is really no final true conclusion, because there is a finitude of philosophical investigation. So in other words, basically aporia is kind of eliciting an attitude of openness within philosopher. A true philosopher is not the one who is able to brag about how much he knows, but then someone who realizes how much he does not know. So that is the starting point of being open. Openness is the essential condition of being a philosopher. Keep this in mind always. So don't be too dogmatic. Yeah, that you can do it, you may do with theology. But when you do philosophy, you should have an open mind. Open mind because, for the simple reason, there is a certain finitude in the philosophical investigation that you undertake. Later, one of the contemporary thinkers who died only in 2006, by name Jacques Derrida, very famously or notoriously known for his idea of deconstruction, he develops aporia to elicit a sense of instability and impossibility of the claims of philosophy. So the claims of philosophy you make are often unstable and they are even impossible. Now, impossibility has a very specific meaning in Derrida. It doesn't mean it is not possible at all. All that he says is that it has a condition for making something possible. That means still there is more possibility that exists. It is in that sense. So, even before you pervade every philosophical claim, argument and system, there is always a lack of rule, lack of decision, undecidability, lack of completeness. And these serve as a reminder of ignorance. So you remember that is why Socrates himself, as a method, Socrates is therefore wonderful. He begins with a presumed ignorance. He doesn't begin with something very categorical, something that he kind of affirms fanatically. It's a presumed ignorance. It's a presumed ignorance that gives way for a certain openness. So I don't know, so let me try to know. It's not that Socrates really doesn't know, but he adopts that as a method, even if he definitely knows more than anybody else. With that, I conclude this idea of elenchus and aporia. More of that when you do other courses, you will realize many of these things will keep coming. For example, the dialectical method will come time and again. And in fact, dialectical method is one of the nice methods when you do research. Instead of having a real interlocutor, somebody with whom you really converse, you can imagine yourself as an interlocutor. So you raise a question to yourself and try to answer it, and then ask another question and try to answer it. So you can see how, I mean, the question emerges from the answer that is given. So there is a gradual progression. Well, the progression does not mean you can finally reach a perfect conclusion, but at least you will reach to a particular stage of an argument which can be considered a reasonable conclusion. However, it can always be revisited and revised. Let us move to the next concept, which is known as Hume's fork. Now, you all are familiar with what a fork is. Note it is not pork, but fork. A fork is something that normally you use on the table when you have your meal. Now, Hume's fork is basically trying to say a fork has at least kind of two hands, let's say two fingers, if you want to think of that as an image. That will have more than two sometimes, but this Hume's fork has just two. Now, for Hume, there are only two kinds of truth claims. Now, these different truth claims, you may group into very many different ways, like a priori, a posteriori, analytic, synthetic, necessary, contingent, but basically there are only two kinds of truth claims. Now, one of the things with these two kinds of truth claim is, you can use a fork to eat a pie with that, this kind of two-fingered fork normally used for dessert. But then each of the fingers in that fork is not so smart or not so useful. So that's the point he's trying to make. Both these kinds of truth claims have their limitations. Now let us try and see what are these two kinds of truth claims. The down below I have given like a cartoon by stating that science is not as smart as it thinks, and reason is not as useful as we want it to be. Now, science is one kind of truth claim, but remember, when Hume refers to science, he refers to empirical science, that which can be tested, verified by the use of your external senses. So reason is something that you kind of logically coordinate ideas in your mind. So that is what a reason is. It's not dependent on your external senses. Now these are two kinds of fingers, two types of truth claims. We'll come to a little more in detail. Let us take these two statements. Look at them for a moment. All criminals have broken the law. That's the first statement. And the second statement is, Mark is a criminal. The truth of these statements, are they same or they are very different in nature? Obviously, they are very different. All criminals have broken the law is a truth statement, the kind of truth that belongs to reason and reason alone. Mark is a criminal, on the other hand, it belongs to empirical verification, therefore empirical science. You look for empirical evidence to come to conclude that Mark is a criminal. Now, you don't use the same empirical method when it comes to the first sentence, because it is by its very logic, criminals imply lawbreakers. So it is mere reasoning is enough. You don't need any empirical efforts. To say somebody in particular is a criminal, you need an empirical evidence. To make a definition of what a criminal is, you don't need an empirical evidence. It is simply logically coordinated. Both statements may be true according to Hume. He is this gentleman, Hume, as you see in the image. He is an English empiricist. So, both of these statements may be equally true, but according to Hume, these statements are true for completely different kinds of reasons. Now, if you understand the difference, in order to understand the difference, you have to understand the fundamental distinction between two types of human knowledge. Otherwise, it would be, you will not be able to make sense of this difference, these two types of human knowledge, because depending on these types of human knowledge, these truths are very different. Okay, so I hope you understand what I am saying. In the first case, the statement all criminals have broken the law is true by definition. So you don't need any way to empirically verify. It is just like the same as we said, bachelor is unmarried. It is by true definition. Because to be a criminal means somebody who breaks the law. If you deny that, it would be a logical contradiction. That is why it is true. But it is of a different kind of truth. It is true because by denying that, you will entail a logical contradiction, and therefore it is true. On the other hand, you have, I further explain this. All truths of mathematics and geometry belong to this category of knowledge, because they are knowledge just because of the relation of ideas. For example, 1 plus 1 equals true because by giving specific meaning to 1 and 2 and the value plus and equals, this statement is true by definition. With the meaning that you are giving to 1, 2 plus and equals, they correspond, then they are true by definition. So therefore, the truth of this particular mathematical formula flows from the meaning of the terms found in the text. It doesn't flow from any empirical evidence. You don't need to verify it by looking at it. By just like, if I say it rains now, so you may have to look and verify it. Now, that would be an empirical evidence. In this case, no. But there is a price that is paid for the certainty of such statements. What is the price? These kind of statements, they do not describe the world in which we live. For example, all criminals break the law does not tell me anything about whether criminals exist, who are those criminals, what laws they have broken, and so on. It doesn't give me any information about the world in which I live in. It merely gives a relation of ideas. Criminal is one idea, breaking the law is another idea. So a statement of this kind only gives me a relation of ideas. It helps me to relate to ideas. That's it. It has any bearing on the world in which I live. It doesn't give me any information about the world in which I live. That is the price we need to pay for the certainty of these statements. These statements are sure. You cannot deny them without contradicting them. So they are absolutely certain and sure. But it doesn't teach us anything. It doesn't tell us anything about the world in which we live. Mark is a criminal is another category. It is not the same as the relation of ideas. This category is called matter of fact. It is matter of fact because its truth or falsity cannot be known by merely paying attention to the meaning of the words in the sentence. It's not enough that you know the meaning of Mark. It's not enough that you know the meaning of criminal. Unlike in the first sentence where you know the meaning of criminal, you know the meaning of breaking the law. These are logically related. So they are relation of ideas. In this case, it's not by merely knowing these you will know. Therefore, to discover whether this kind of statement is true, we have to look at the events in the world. In this case, obviously, you have to look at Mark. So, what goes on in the world around us, by verifying them, we can ascertain the truth or falsity of this statement. So it is a factual verification. So this is of a different kind of truth. The first one is relation of ideas, and the second one is matter of fact. So matters of fact are informative. I now know something about Mark, that he is a criminal. So it's not only about Mark, it can be said about any event, for example. I know something about the event, I know something about a place, I know something about a particular climatic condition. Now these are different kinds of information about the world in which we live. Whereas relations of ideas do not give me such information. But at the same time, when it comes to matters of fact, we do not have the same kind of certainty of truth as we have in relation of ideas. In relation of ideas, it cannot be refuted. Now, Mark is a criminal, can be verified by some means, but it also can be refuted by other means. So we can never have 100% certainty when it comes to matters of fact. What is fact is something that can be very disputable and it can be contested. So, most of the time. So, it doesn't have the same, in itself, in principle it doesn't have. In some cases it may have certain certainty, yes, but most of the time it doesn't. It doesn't have that rock sure certainty as a relation of ideas have. So to conclude, Hume's fork divides human knowledge into two distinct spheres. The first sphere is a relation of ideas that do not describe the world or give any information about the world, but it gives me logical certainty. And the second category is the matter of fact that do describe the world, gives information about the world, but it is only provisional. So for Hume, what matters first is the impressions that we have. So therefore the matters of fact is more important in a certain sense, because they give us, they are direct products of our immediate sense experience. Matters of fact are direct products of our immediate sense experience, and therefore it includes certain passion and emotions. Ideas, they are they can be related together, but they are very cold. Because it doesn't give me any vivid image of the immediate sense experience. Now each idea and impression, they are distinct, but they can be linked for Hume to association. That is the mental category of Hume. So what you need to retain is how Hume divides knowledge into two kinds. Relation of ideas, which doesn't give us any new information, but it gives me certainty. Whereas matter of fact, they give information about the world, but the truth of it is always provisional. So it is not very sure, it's not very certain like the relation of ideas. Now you go back to the first slide and realize when Hume, the cartoon image that I had, well, science is not as smart as it thinks because it doesn't give certainty. Whereas reason is not as useful as we like to have them to be, because reason does not give us any new information. The power of Hume's folk is that from it we can make this following conclusion. Any argument which purports to show that the world must be a certain way is sure to be flawed. Now this is the insight from Hume's folk, that we can show the world must be in a certain way. This particular approach is sure to be a failure, sure to be a flaw. In the history of philosophy, we have many such arguments, that the universe must have a first cause, time and space must be infinitely divisible, there must be a God. If you take Hume's folk seriously, all these arguments are unsound. And for this very reason, Hume's folk is a very powerful principle. Though it may be contested in the modern day, it is still considered a very basically sound principle by many philosophers today. So with that, I conclude this particular lecture for this 8th lecture. So we will give some time for question and answer. If there are certain things not clear, then we will answer that before we go on to the next lecture. Thank you very much. In this 9th lecture, we are going to discuss another two important philosophical tools, Ceteris Paribus and category mistake. These are some of the concepts that are oftentimes used as part of our reasoning to make us aware of certain nuances in our reasoning process. So therefore these two philosophical tools are equally important. Let us begin with Ceteris Paribus. Let us take a simple thought experiment. Suppose you want your brain to be transplanted in another body. So also the other person's brain will be transplanted into your body. So basically you are swapping. When your brain is transplanted, your thoughts, memories and personality goes into the other body. Let us call this particular brain getting transplanted to the other body your brain. So into your body, what which you receive is another person's brain, and we call this your body. Now before you are ready to undertake operation, you have to make sure that all your properties and bank accounts are to be associated either with your brain or with your body, because they are not going to be now together. Your brain is going to be in somebody else's body, that is your brain, and somebody else is going to be in your body, that's your body. Would you like to give your properties, your assets, your money to your brain or to your body? So you are a person who would like to act out of self-interest. Which one would you choose? Your brain or your body? Now, this is a simple thought experiment. It's not a real thing, it's only an imaginary one, that's why it's called a thought experiment. But this helps us to understand what Ceteris paribus is it. Now, in order to answer this kind of question, if you are a well-trained thinker, a philosopher, you would assume that this thought experiment implicitly contains Ceteris paribus. Now, Ceteris paribus is a Latin term. You know the word etc. Etc. means and other things. So, Ceteris therefore is referring to other things. Paribus means having the equal kind of value, or it is being the same. So now Ceteris paribus therefore imply that other things remain equal. What are the other things? Except the change of the swapping that happens between your body and your brain through the operation, other things remain the same. What are the other things possibly? The health of both the bodies and both the brains, they remain the same. They remain equal. You are not taking those things, into consideration. The gender of the bodies, they remain equal. One is not prettier and the other is uglier. That has the same value. One of the persons is a wonderful social person and the other person is an antisocial, a criminal. No, it doesn't exist that way. All other things, they have the same value, except now through operation there is a swap. Your brain goes into somebody else's body, somebody else's brain comes into your body. Except this difference, everything else has the same value. Everything else remains same or equal. So that is what is known as Ceteris paribus. All other things remain equal. So this is implicitly there. Otherwise, this will create a lot of other confusion. Now we are only determining whether your money should go to, or your asset should go to your brain or your body, which assumes that in every other matter, other things remain equal. So when we talk about all other things being equal, of course we talk about the normal conditions. So it is not the unusual circumstances. For example, if you are discussing a mass murder, Ceteris paribus, it is assumed that the murderer was not given an ultimatum stating that if he did not kill 20 people by noon, the whole world will be blown up. So that would be an unusual circumstance. It's not a normal condition. So Ceteris paribus is normally applied to the normal conditions, all other things being equal. So this principle has a use in assessing the merits of two explanations and deciding between them, even when there is no overwhelming evidence for either. The only sensible way to reach a decision is to look at the available evidence and ask Ceteris paribus, which is the better decision. In other words, all other things remain equal. Only you have a dilemma about that particular choice that you want to make. Now, in reality, all other things may not be equal. For example, there may be evidences that are not discovered. But in the absence of such evidence, we have to focus on what we know and assume that all other things are equal until they are shown otherwise. One such case would be that of an innocent person accused of being a serial killer. Let us take this example. This innocent person has no family or friends, And if he is convicted, the angry masses will be appeased. This is a typical ethical question. If he is set free, there will be a widespread fear and anger with lynch mobs ready to attack him. So in ethics or moral philosophy, we have an approach called utilitarian approach, according to which you do an action that produces overall increase in happiness for the greatest number of people. But then, you should insert, many argue that you should insert a ceteris paribus clause. Doing something that would increase the overall happiness of the greatest number of people is fine if all other things remain equal. In other words, it does not change the dynamics of any other moral consideration. Now, which would mean in this particular case, suppose if you are convicting an innocent person who is not responsible for serial killing, but you convict him because that would appease the anger of the mob, and obviously that would therefore increase the overall happiness in the greatest number of people. Would that be still just? That would be the important question to be asked. So all other things remain equal. So the question of justice should remain the same. It cannot change there. If it changes there, then that becomes problematic. So the ceteris paribus clause helps us to focus on the decision sharply on the relevant features of the argument. That is the purpose of this. Now try and apply this to the famous encounter that happened recently in two cases. One in Uttar Pradesh, not in Uttar Pradesh exactly, but I think it was bringing to Uttar Pradesh from Rajasthan on the way. And the other one that happened, I think in Telangana, somewhere in Hyderabad. We will come back to that during the discussion, but keep that in mind. Can you apply the ceteris paribus clause in that situation? Now the second important philosophical tool is category mistake. Now category mistake is a notion that is primarily advanced by Gilbert Ryle in one of the classical works, The Concept of Mind. Of course, Gilbert Ryle is an analytical philosopher, but he is influenced by the German phenomenologist Edmund Husserl. Now, you don't need to remember all these details, but what you need to remember is Gilbert Ryle is the one who advanced this idea of category mistake. Now, what is a category mistake? You have a cartoon here. What time does the game start? 2 p.m. So the person who asked the question responds, dang it, all I brought was an AM radio. So 2 p.m. has nothing to do with AM radio. The AM radio is very different from ante-meridian, which is normally used for time. So these are different categories. Confusing these categories is category mistake. We tend to oftentimes confuse categories one with another. I mean, in this case, normally we don't do. It is like a joke, but there are very many instances we do that. So that is what is known as category mistake. Now here I have the image of the Oxford University. You are walking through the university and then you go to the lecture halls, you go to the library, you go to the amphitheater there, you go to the playing field, you go to the different places there. and say, okay, all these things I have visited, now where is the Oxford University? That is a category mistake. Because you are trying to think of Oxford University in terms of a specific place like the library. The Oxford University is of another category which comprises of all these things. That's why the normal expression we say you should not compare oranges with apples. That would be a category mistake. So the Oxford University is a university which has many buildings. You cannot somehow think of that as one building. Sometimes universities may have many campuses. So that is the category mistake we are talking about. Now they have got another image here of cricket players. I don't know which teams are playing there. I think looks like India is batting though. From the jersey, probably it is New Zealand, which is fielding. Now suppose if everybody is speaking about the team spirit, alongside they are talking about the bowler, the batsman, and the skipper, and things like that. They keep wicket keeper, and they say all these kind of words, and they speak also about team spirit. Suppose if you ask, now who is the one who is supposed to exercise the team spirit? That is a category mistake. So because you tend to think of the team spirit in the same category as batsman or bowler or wicket keeper and so on and so forth. That is exactly the category mistake, mixing one category with another category. Now how does it apply to philosophy? This is particularly Gilbert Ryle pointed out. This is the problem with Descartes. You have not studied Descartes yet. We will come study that the next credit. But as an example, you can keep that in mind. One of the greatest problems for Descartes is that he thought of mind as a material, as an object, not material, but an object. Just like we have got material objects like body, we have got other kinds of objects, which is mind. So mind is similar to body. Body is an object, so also is mind. So Descartes would think your brain is an object, though not material. So mind is an object, though not material. Now that is a category mistake according to Ryle. Mind is merely your abilities and capacities. You cannot categorize them along with your body, which is an object. So that is the biggest mistake that Descartes made. I am not going to explain the details of the mind-body problem that Descartes ran into, which has a serious problem in philosophy. But the idea that for you to get is, Gilbert criticizes Descartes of this particular thing. So also is the question of will. When people speak about will, they think, human will, they think about as a particular thing. A will is not a particular thing. It is again your ability. So your ability is different from your hand. You cannot equate, you cannot put the will alongside your hand as of the same category. They are of different categories. So this confusion is oftentimes brought into philosophy because people don't realize these belong to different categories. Bringing these categories together is a huge mistake. That is what is known as a category mistake. It has serious problem, like in epistemology, as I pointed out, in Descartes, or it has problems also in the understanding of human person. Now to conclude this lecture, this is only a cartoon. What was Descartes known for? So if you didn't know Descartes, he is known for his famous statement, I think, therefore I am. The question that the person asked, how did he die? A bartender asked him, would you like another drink? He said, I think not, and disappeared. I think therefore I am, and I think not, I am no longer. So that is the idea. Anyway, that's meant to be a joke, nothing serious about it, but You will learn about I think, therefore I am more in your history of Western philosophy. So this is a category mistake. With this I conclude this lecture. This is a very short lecture because this is only this very simpler concepts, Ceteris paribus and category mistake.